My beloved child, pause here for a moment, because what you are about to hear was meant to find you at a strangely important point in your journey. Do not rush past these words as though they are ordinary. Something has been shifting beneath the silence, something your eyes could not see and your heart could only sense. There is a conversation that has been delayed, rehearsed in private, abandoned, rewritten, and carried silently through restless moments. The person connected to your heart has been holding words they no longer know how to keep inside. And in this fictional message of divine reflection, imagine heaven drawing back the curtain just enough for you to understand why their heart has suddenly become so unsettled. They want to speak to you. Not someday in a distant future. Not after everything becomes perfect. Their emotions have reached a point where silence is beginning to feel heavier than honesty, and what they have been trying to say may reveal far more than you expect. You have wondered why the energy around this connection has felt different lately. Perhaps nothing obvious changed on the outside. Perhaps there was no dramatic announcement, no undeniable sign, no perfect explanation. Yet somewhere within you, there may have been a quiet feeling that something unfinished was moving closer to the surface. You could not name it. You could not prove it. But you felt a subtle tension between what has already happened and what still needs to be said. My child, that tension is where this story begins. Your soulmate has been standing at an emotional doorway, looking backward at everything they avoided and forward at everything they could still choose. And the most surprising part is not simply that they want to talk. It is what finally caused them to stop running from the conversation. For longer than you realize, they have been attempting to convince themselves that certain feelings would disappear if they ignored them long enough. They distracted themselves. They filled their days. They told themselves that time would make everything easier, that unanswered emotions eventually become irrelevant, that silence could protect them from vulnerability. But some connections do not become quieter simply because people refuse to name them. Sometimes the unspoken becomes louder. Sometimes the heart begins repeating what the mind is desperately trying to forget. And in the stillness, when there was no one around to impress and nowhere left to hide, thoughts of you returned. Not as a passing memory, but as a question they could not answer: what if I waited too long? That question changed something. At first, they pushed it away. They told themselves there would always be another opportunity, another day, another moment when the circumstances would be easier. Yet each time they postponed what they truly wanted to say, another thought appeared: what if the person I care about finally stops waiting for clarity? What if they discover peace without me? What if they realize they deserve someone who does not hesitate? Suddenly, silence no longer felt safe. It felt dangerous to the connection they had assumed would somehow remain available forever. And this is where the emotional truth becomes deeper, because they are not only thinking about speaking to you. They are beginning to understand what their silence may have made you feel. There were moments when you needed clarity and received confusion. Moments when a simple truth could have saved you from questioning yourself. Moments when you may have wondered whether you imagined the depth between you because they did not express what was happening inside them. They know this now more than they did before. They are beginning to see your experience, not only their own. That realization has been uncomfortable. It has forced them to confront the possibility that while they were protecting themselves from rejection, they may have unintentionally left you carrying uncertainty. And there is something very specific about this realization that has been following them lately. It is connected to a memory involving you, a moment they once considered small, but now understand differently. They remember something you said, or perhaps something you did without realizing how deeply it affected them. It was not necessarily dramatic. Maybe you were simply kind when they expected distance. Maybe you remained patient when they were emotionally guarded. Maybe you looked at them in a way that made them feel understood without forcing them to explain themselves. At the time, they did not know what to do with that feeling. They stored it away. But recently, that memory returned with unusual intensity. And when it returned, they finally understood what had been hidden inside it. You were offering them something real, and they were too afraid to fully receive it. Imagine them sitting alone with that realization. The room is quiet. Their phone is nearby. Your name crosses their mind, perhaps your face, perhaps a conversation, perhaps a moment when they almost told you everything. They replay it differently now. They notice the hesitation in their own voice. They remember the words they almost said. They recognize the exact moment fear took control. And suddenly they understand that what they once called bad timing may have partly been emotional avoidance. They were waiting for certainty before becoming vulnerable, but love rarely offers certainty first. It asks for courage before guarantees. That truth has been difficult for them to accept, because it means the barrier between you may not have been fate at all. It may have been fear wearing the disguise of timing. And now another layer is being revealed. Your soulmate does not merely want to tell you that they miss you. That would be too simple. Missing someone can exist without transformation. What has shaken them is the realization that their feelings have survived distance, confusion, pride, distractions, and every attempt to rationalize them away. They expected time to reduce your importance. Instead, time exposed it. They began comparing other interactions, other conversations, other moments of connection, and something kept feeling incomplete. It was not because everyone else lacked value. It was because what they experienced with you touched a part of them they had rarely allowed anyone to reach. And they are finally admitting that to themselves. But here is where the mystery deepens. Admitting it privately is not the same as saying it to you. That is the battle happening now. One part of them wants to reach out immediately, to stop overthinking and simply tell you the truth. Another part fears how much may have changed. They wonder whether you still feel what you once felt. They wonder whether you would listen. They wonder whether their honesty would arrive as relief or as something painfully late. They have imagined several versions of the conversation. In one, you respond warmly and everything they have carried begins to dissolve. In another, you remain guarded, and they realize they must earn access to a heart they once assumed would always understand them. And strangely, that second possibility is no longer making them run away. It is making them realize that real connection requires accountability. This is important, my child, because the conversation they want is becoming less about receiving reassurance from you and more about finally giving you the truth you deserved. They want to explain why they became distant at certain moments. They want to tell you what was happening internally when their behavior seemed confusing. There were emotions they did not understand, pressures they did not know how to communicate, and fears they were ashamed to admit. None of this erases the impact of their choices, and somewhere within them they know that. They are not searching for a magical sentence that makes everything disappear. What they secretly hope for is a chance to be understood accurately, perhaps for the first time. And there is one truth in particular they have struggled to admit. They were more affected by you than they ever allowed you to see. Your presence challenged them. Not because you were demanding something impossible, but because being truly seen can be terrifying to someone accustomed to controlling how much of themselves others are allowed to know. You noticed details. You sensed changes in their energy. You understood when their words did not match what their eyes seemed to carry. There were moments when they felt exposed around you, not in a harmful way, but in the way that happens when another person begins recognizing the parts of you that even you avoid confronting. They could feel themselves becoming emotionally visible, and instead of moving closer, they sometimes pulled away. At the time, you may have interpreted that withdrawal as lack of interest. But in this story, imagine the opposite being closer to the truth. Sometimes people retreat because nothing is there. But sometimes they retreat because too much is there, and they have not developed the courage to handle it. Your soulmate began sensing that this connection could require honesty at a level they were not prepared for. They could no longer remain half-present. They could not offer fragments and pretend those fragments were enough. Something about you called them toward a fuller version of themselves, and that frightened them because growth always threatens the identities we have become comfortable hiding behind. Still, something changed recently. A moment occurred that made them realize you may no longer be standing emotionally where they left you. Perhaps they noticed your energy becoming more peaceful. Perhaps they sensed that you were beginning to detach from needing answers. Perhaps they imagined you moving forward without looking over your shoulder. Whatever triggered it, the possibility of genuinely losing access to your heart created a clarity they had been postponing. For the first time, they recognized the difference between knowing someone cares and assuming that care will wait indefinitely. That distinction hit them deeply. They began thinking about all the things they never told you. The gratitude. The admiration. The moments you inspired them without knowing. The times your words stayed in their mind long after the conversation ended. The strange comfort they experienced simply knowing you existed somewhere in the world. And then came the harder memories, the times they could have spoken honestly but chose silence, the times they allowed pride to interrupt vulnerability, the moments they made you question whether the connection mattered to them at all. Now they understand something that may surprise you. They did not always know how much you mattered because they had never experienced your absence honestly. As long as they believed the connection was somehow waiting in the background, they could postpone confronting its importance. But once the thought appeared that you might truly move forward, something inside them changed. Suddenly your absence was no longer theoretical. It became a possible future. And they discovered that the future they had been casually assuming would be fine without clarity did not feel fine at all. This is why they want to talk now. Not because some invisible force is commanding you to respond. Not because you owe anyone access to your heart, but because within this cinematic spiritual story, your soulmate has reached a threshold where silence no longer represents comfort. It represents the possibility of permanent misunderstanding. They do not want the story between you to be defined by assumptions. They want you to know what was real, even if they cannot control what happens afterward. And the words they are preparing are more vulnerable than you might expect. They may begin carefully. They may not reveal everything in the first sentence. They might ask how you have been, pretend the conversation is casual, or search for some ordinary doorway into an extraordinary confession. But beneath those opening words there is something trembling. They have rehearsed what comes next. They have imagined saying, "There is something I should have told you a long time ago." They have imagined admitting that they think about you more often than they ever confessed. They have imagined telling you that distance did not create indifference. It created awareness. Yet there is another reason they have hesitated, and this one goes deeper than fear of rejection. And something remarkable is happening as they consider the answers. They are beginning to discover truths about themselves they had never articulated. Their fear of vulnerability may not have started with you. It may come from much older experiences, moments when honesty was not rewarded, moments when closeness became associated with loss, moments when they learned that appearing detached felt safer than being deeply invested. You did not create those defenses. You simply became the person who made those defenses impossible to ignore. There is a reason your connection felt intense even during quiet periods. It was revealing both of you to yourselves. You learned where you needed stronger boundaries, where you had been tempted to chase clarity, where you needed to trust your own worth instead of measuring it through someone else's response. And they were confronted with the opposite lesson, that withholding love does not create safety. Sometimes it only creates distance. Both hearts were being asked different questions. Yours may have been, can you love without abandoning yourself? Theirs may have been, can you be honest without running from vulnerability? And now those two questions are moving toward the same conversation. But do not assume you already know how this conversation ends. That is not what this message is revealing. The important thing is not a guaranteed reunion, a promised outcome, or a perfect romantic ending. The important thing is truth becoming possible where confusion once lived. You are being reminded that genuine connection does not require you to ignore your boundaries, lower your standards, or accept half-hearted effort. If someone approaches you sincerely, you can listen without surrendering your discernment. You can remain compassionate without forgetting what your heart learned. You can receive an apology without pretending there was never pain. And you can allow a conversation to unfold without forcing it to become a future before it has proven itself worthy of one. Your soulmate is beginning to understand this too. They know words alone may not restore what inconsistency damaged. They are realizing that saying, "I care about you," means little if their actions continue speaking another language. This has become part of their inner struggle. They do not only want to tell you something. They are asking themselves whether they are prepared to live according to what they say. That question has kept them awake inside their thoughts. Because if they finally tell you that you matter, then they can no longer pretend their choices do not affect you. If they admit that the connection is important, responsibility enters the room. They would have to become clearer, more consistent, more intentional. They would have to stop expecting you to understand what they refuse to communicate. And somewhere deep within them, they know this conversation could mark the end of an old pattern. But before that happens, something else must be confessed. There was a moment when they almost contacted you recently. They came closer than you realize. Perhaps they opened a message and stared at the empty space. Perhaps they typed your name. Perhaps they wrote something and erased it. Perhaps they imagined hearing your voice and then convinced themselves the timing was wrong. What stopped them was not lack of feeling. It was the sudden realization that once they began, they might not be able to return to pretending everything was ordinary. Because the truth they want to share is not small. They have been trying to decide how much to reveal at once. Should they tell you everything? Should they begin with the simplest truth? Should they admit their regret? Should they tell you what they realized during your distance? Should they explain the specific moment that changed their perspective? They fear overwhelming you, yet they also fear holding back again. Their heart is caught between caution and urgency. And there is one sentence they keep returning to. It is not, "I miss you." It is deeper. The sentence forming inside them sounds more like this: "I finally understand what you were trying to show me." That realization changes the entire story. Because perhaps you once tried to communicate something they were not emotionally ready to hear. Maybe you wanted honesty, consistency, mutual effort, or simply reassurance that the connection was real. They might have interpreted your need for clarity as pressure because clarity would have required them to confront themselves. But now, after time and distance have stripped away some of their defenses, they see your intentions differently. You were not necessarily asking them to become someone else. You were asking them to stop hiding. And that is why this conversation has become so important. They want to tell you that they understand now. They understand why certain moments hurt you. They understand why you eventually became quieter. They understand that your silence was not always indifference, perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps you stopped explaining because you realized love should not require endless persuasion. Perhaps you withdrew your energy because you needed to protect your peace. They noticed. Even if they never admitted it, they noticed when your energy changed. The warmth that once reached toward them became calmer. The constant emotional availability became less predictable. You began becoming someone who could still care without chasing. And strangely, that may have been the moment they finally began listening. Your absence from an old pattern became louder than your words had ever been. This is not about manipulation. It is about consequence. Sometimes people only recognize what they were receiving after it is no longer automatically offered. Your soulmate began recognizing the emotional safety you created, the patience you showed, the way you cared even during uncertain moments. They started understanding that those things were not guaranteed. And then came a thought they could not escape: what if I never told them what they actually meant to me? That thought became the beginning of their courage. They started imagining a future in which you never knew the truth. Years passing. Different paths unfolding. both of you remembering fragments of something that might have become meaningful but never received honesty. That imagined future disturbed them more than rejection. Because rejection would hurt once. Regret might echo for years. So now the balance has shifted. Their fear has not disappeared. Their uncertainty has not vanished. But another emotion has become stronger than both, the need to stop leaving the most important things unsaid. And my child, there is something you must remember if this fictional story mirrors any emotion within your own life. You do not need to chase the conversation. You do not need to predict it. You do not need to search every notification for proof. Allow truth to demonstrate itself through real communication and real behavior. Your peace does not have to become dependent on whether another person finally becomes brave enough to speak. Your worth was never hidden inside their silence. Still, the story is moving. The person connected to you has begun considering not only what they want to say, but when they should say it. And that is where another unexpected detail appears. There is a reason they feel a stronger sense of urgency now. Something recently reminded them that circumstances can change quickly. A conversation with someone, an observation, a memory, or an ordinary moment suddenly made them see their hesitation differently. They realized there may never be a perfectly safe moment. There will always be reasons to wait. There will always be uncertainty. There will always be a possibility that honesty changes everything. But perhaps everything needs to change. That thought frightened them, then strangely freed them. Because for the first time, they stopped asking, "How do I make sure this conversation goes exactly the way I want?" and began asking, "How do I make sure I finally tell the truth?" That difference is enormous. Control wants guarantees. Love asks for sincerity. And as they move closer to this conversation, they are slowly releasing the illusion that they can control your response. They know you may need time. They know you may ask hard questions. They know you may not immediately trust what they say. Yet they are beginning to accept that your reaction belongs to you. Their responsibility is simply to become honest. And once they accepted that, another confession rose to the surface, one they had buried beneath every simpler explanation. They have been carrying jealousy, not necessarily toward another specific person, but toward the future version of your life that may no longer include them. They imagine you laughing freely again. They imagine you building new memories. They imagine someone else eventually seeing the qualities they once took for granted. And something inside them aches, not because they believe they own you, but because they recognize what they risked losing through indecision. That realization has humbled them. They once believed having strong feelings was enough. Now they understand feelings without communication can become invisible. Love without courage can look exactly like indifference from the outside. And intentions without action cannot build trust. These are the truths they are beginning to face before speaking to you. Yet one final barrier remains. There is something they believe you do not know. Something connected to the period when the two of you felt most distant. You may have assumed they were unaffected during that time. You may have thought they moved through their days without thinking much about what had happened. But behind the surface, there was a private emotional moment they never told you about. A moment when the reality of potentially losing you became impossible to ignore. They were alone when it happened. No audience. No performance. No one to reassure them. Something reminded them of you unexpectedly. Perhaps a familiar phrase, a place, a song, a photograph, or simply the silence at the end of a long day. And for once, they did not push the feeling away. They let themselves remember everything. Your voice. Your patience. Your frustration. Your kindness. The conversations that meant more than they admitted. The goodbye that felt too unfinished. And then they realized something that changed the way they saw the entire connection. They had spent so much time wondering whether you understood them that they never stopped to ask whether they had truly understood you. That question broke through something. They started replaying the relationship from your perspective. They saw moments when you were trying to meet them halfway and they remained behind emotional walls. They remembered when you asked for clarity and they offered uncertainty. They remembered when your heart was open and theirs was guarded. And suddenly your later distance made sense. You were not punishing them. You were protecting what remained of your peace. That realization created regret, but it also created something more useful, responsibility. They cannot undo yesterday. But they can decide who speaks when tomorrow arrives. And now they are standing closer to that decision than before. Their phone may still feel heavy in their hand. Their mind may still generate 1,000 reasons to delay. But beneath all that noise, a quieter voice is becoming stronger. Say it before silence decides the ending for you. And my child, the most extraordinary part is that the first thing they want to tell you may not be the thing you have been expecting. They are not preparing only a confession of affection. They are preparing to reveal what happened inside them during the silence. They want you to understand what finally shifted. They want to tell you why their perspective changed. And they want to admit something about the way they have been seeing you recently that they have never said aloud. Because while you may have thought they were simply missing you, something much deeper has been happening. They have been recognizing your value without having constant access to your presence. They have been learning the difference between wanting someone and being ready to honor them. They have been confronting the difference between emotional intensity and emotional maturity. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, they are beginning to understand that love is not proven by how strongly someone feels when they are alone. It is proven by what they are willing to do with those feelings when another heart is involved. This is the point where their confession changes. Because once they understood that, they made a private decision. A decision concerning what they will no longer hide if they get the chance to speak with you. They decided that if the conversation happens, they do not want to leave you guessing anymore. They want to tell you what you meant. They want to explain what frightened them. They want to acknowledge where they failed to communicate. And then, after all of that, they want to ask you one question. A question they have rehearsed repeatedly. A question they are afraid to hear answered. A question that could completely redefine what comes next. But before you hear what that question is, there is one more hidden truth behind their sudden urgency, and this is the part they have told almost no one. They are worried you will see through them immediately. They know you understand their patterns. They know vague words may not be enough anymore. If they come toward you now, they sense they must come with sincerity. They cannot hide behind ambiguity. They cannot expect you to translate mixed signals forever. They may need to answer questions they once avoided. Why did you pull away? Why did you wait? Why did you act unaffected? What changed? What do you actually want? Those questions have been echoing inside them before you ever ask them. Recently, someone said something to them about you. It was not gossip. It was not meant to create drama. It was one simple observation that struck them harder than the speaker could have known. The words forced your soulmate to realize that while they were still deciding whether to speak, you might already be entering a chapter where their hesitation no longer has power over you. They tried to dismiss the comment. They could not. They carried it home. They replayed it in silence. And then, for the first time, they admitted to themselves exactly what they would feel if they discovered they had waited until the door between you had quietly closed. That was when they reached for their phone. That was when they opened your name. That was when the message they had been afraid to write finally began appearing on the screen. And the first sentence they typed was not what anyone would expect.